Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the evolution of data-driven security, the Information Security Practitioner's Guide to Better Security. My name is Raleigh Gould and I will be your moderator for today's event. Our featured speaker is Enterprise Management Associates Research Director, Risk and Security Management, David Monahan. David's in-depth security experience, which spans over 15 years, has included organizing and managing physical and information security programs. Additionally, David has diverse audit and compliance and risk and privacy experience. Prior to joining Enterprise Management Associates, David spent almost 10 years at AT&T Solutions, focused on the network security discipline. While David will defer answering your questions until the conclusion of his presentation, I did want today's audience to know that you can log your questions at any time throughout the course of the presentation by using the Q&A functionality. Also, today's event is being recorded and you will receive a follow-up email from Enterprise Management Associates tomorrow that will include the on-demand playback. So look out for that email from EMA tomorrow. And before I hand things over to David, I did want today's audience to be aware of our research sponsors of the data-driven security research. A big thanks to Bay Dynamics and Guidance Software. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our featured speaker, David Monahan. David?
Thanks, Raleigh. I appreciate everyone coming by today. We have some pretty interesting information to share with you, so I think your time will be well spent. Let's get on with it. So first of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about the information around demographics and how we got to where we are, show you a little bit about the information on the folks that actually responded to our survey and participated. So you can see here that we had a pretty good representation in terms of operating geographies. North America was heavily represented, but additionally we have a good contingent from EMEA as well as Asia Pacific and Central and South America. The most interesting part of the demographics was I think Santa must have gotten a letter because we have some folks in rest of world, and I'm not quite sure where those came from because I don't have any detailed information. They just clicked rest of world. So they either wanted to be anonymous or they were living somewhere in Antarctica, North Pole, or something like that. In terms of the represented industries, we had a really nice cross-section. Multiple industries represented. There was no significant or a very large winner, if you will, in this particular area. We can see that we did have a contingent from finance and banking of 18%. That was the largest, but not very much larger than, for example, manufacturing or the aerospace and defense and government industries. So I think we have a well-rounded set of data for various industries, and in this particular case, the all other category was actually fairly small as well, so that doesn't tend to tip the scales too much. Down at the bottom of the slide, you can see there were quite a few areas that we included in the all others just because there was a very small representation from each one of those individual entities and it's physically non-significant. So to make their answers more significant, we combine them together. Organizational size, we had a very large organizational size from the large enterprise environment. 31%, so that was very interesting, and that would tend to be representative of government as well. Additionally, we had a pretty large contingent from the larger end of the small to medium enterprise or SME area at 29%, but then we also had some good representation from smaller companies as well, anything less than 2,500 personnel up through 10,000 personnel. So I think that was pretty representative of the overall demographics of businesses as well in terms of the people that we can find. Very, very nice cross-section. A little more interesting information in terms of demographics and what's going on with the budgets in terms of other folks out there. I'm sure you're interested in that. Is my budget as big as your budget, or how is that going? So, from the demographic perspective, we have two sections here. We have the organizations that were represented in the last time that we did a similar study with the data-driven security. And those were in 2011, 2012 budget timeframes, as well as comparing that today to the ones we got from 2013 and 2014. You can see here that the budgets in the area of 10 to 25% were increased. We went from 15 to 25%. We lost some on the bottom end. We lost some on the top end. But that's a very healthy area for budgets to be increasing. So I thought from that perspective it was very indicative of the times in terms of the economy turning around, more business, more revenue. We also saw more revenue, and that's not included in the slides, but there was more revenue And additionally, we have some information on the budgets in terms of the percent of IT overall. So if we look at this particular slide here, we can see that the budget's moved in terms of percentage of IT budget down to the 10 to 14% range from the both ends, which again, that's a very healthy number to be in. So I think that's representative of the economy turning around a little bit and giving us some benefit in terms of increased revenues and attention. So with that, you can see that we lost from the high, we lost from the low end down here. We also lost from the high end. I'd really like to know from a company perspective who's able to spend 30+% of their IT budget on security, because that's hopefully got to be a very strong program, very good. Unfortunately, I don't have that level of detail as it was an anonymous study. Security supporters, I think this slide is very significant in a number of factors. We looked at who vocally expresses support for security and compared that to whose respondents feel actively backs them and gives them the dollars to actually complete projects. So we did have some good showings, but I think there's some neat things to bring out here. First of all, the CIOs are the most actively supporting in terms of giving money to projects. Now, this can be explained fairly straightforwardly in that there's more CIOs out there than there are CISOs or CSOs. So we see that's representative of the fact that there's proportionally a CIO in most every organization or someone that represents that function, where there isn't necessarily someone that represents a CISO or CSO, though there are individuals that would represent mid-level information security managers and other managers. So the CIOs are really putting forth effort in terms of actively backing the investment. They realize that there's an issue out there. They understand that they're on the line as well as other executive management if they're not properly investing in security. And I think this goes along also with the change in mindset we've had over the last couple of years of it's not if I get breached, but when I get breached. They're trying to avoid that as long as possible and maybe be on the lucky side of, not during my watch kind of mentality. It's good to see that CISOs are, investing in their own programs, so that's a plus as well. The thing I thought was interesting, however, with these other numbers is you see these three that stick out here. We're seeing a lot of vocally expressed interest and support amongst security managers, managers outside security, and the managers that are outside of IT and security. So these folks recognize that they need support. I think the issue here and why you see a drop in between these numbers is that these folks don't necessarily control the budgets. Right? They need support. They want support. But ultimately, they're influencers at best. They're probably not contributors for the budget's sake. So this is why we see a kind of a gap between the vocal versus actively backing investments. And ultimately, when we look at this, we need those budget champions that can come in and help us to support those particular aspects of our projects. Because if we don't have money, we don't have projects. We all know that. Another thing that came out that was interesting was compared to the last study that we did in this area, there are fewer security personnel out there. Definitely fewer large security teams, even though we had a very large contingent of enterprise that we noted in the beginning in our demographics, and that's why I brought that out. We can see that we had 13-point difference between 2012 versus 2014. Even though there's more money, what's going on? Well, it appears as though that we're really having a skills issue, and I think we hear that a lot from the industry in general. It's hard to find qualified people. It's hard to get them deployed. It's hard to keep them. And I think we're coming back to more of a security employees market in that people are being lured away and moving around. So hopefully it doesn't get too bad. We've seen that in the past during the dot-com boom, years ago, where folks didn't stay very long at all. It was just a matter of hopping to the biggest paycheck or whatever the appealing factor was. I hope we don't get to that point because we know that detracts from security overall. We don't tend to get momentum out of our programs, and we do a lot of false starts because that technical talent is leaving. There are some alternatives that we're going to talk about in this particular study that came out on how we address this. People are definitely important, but we do need to figure out how we can operate when there's just not enough people, regardless of whether they're hopping jobs or not. If there's not enough people, someone's going to be on the low end of that totem pole, and we're going to have to deal with that. Frustrations with IT security practices. So there were a couple common themes that come out throughout a number of the different questions that we ask within the IT security practices, and why things aren't progressing or why folks are frustrated. And I think that this one is very common. 43%, not percentage-wise, but we see this across multiple industries, multiple areas, and that there just aren't enough people. So that supports the previous slide in terms of the size of security departments. Additionally, it's too difficult separating the legitimate activity from the malicious activity. We need better technology, and we're going to talk about that as well as we move later on in the slides. But this is a serious concern. There are a lot of security technologies deployed. There's a lot of smart people out there, but there is difficulty in being able to identify what's good activity, what's bad activity, what's anomalous activity that could be good or bad. How do we separate this out and do it in a reasonable period of time? From that perspective, if we can't do that, we know that impacts our remediation timeframes, which ultimately also impacts our bottom lines. If you notice also that two of these items, the first and the third, result specifically around personnel. So we keep supporting that same idea that there aren't enough folks out there that have security training and relevant experience. The third one and most of the others are also related to technology or communication ability. You can see here that there are a significant number of folks that say, we don't know how to be able to communicate our information, our data, in a meaningful way to our stakeholders. We know this is a key issue, both from a delivery perspective, because there's a gap there. You have the technical folks that don't really understand business and how to speak business, and you have the business folks that don't really understand how to speak technical. And of course, the biggest issue with that gap is the ability to collect dollars for your projects. If you don't have a technically astute CIO or senior manager in there somewhere that can talk to the CIO or above, then you're not going to get the backing for those technical programs, because they're going to see it as a loss. We do have to remember that security is insurance. Right? There's the investment there is to prevent activities. And therefore it's relating to an insurance type of a model. It's not just going to stop something. It's preventative. Something might happen. So we have to remember that when we're communicating with the business and how that's going to affect return on investment for various technologies we already have in place, as well as new technologies. What's the total cost of ownership on the long haul? Not just the initial investment. Is there capital investment? Is it just expense? And that also plays into whether we choose to do on-premises activities or whether we look at cloud and those types of things. But these are all relevant in terms of our discussion around the dollars and how we get them and how we improve our security programs. What do the respondents see about the most needed improvements for information security as a discipline? So this was a multi-select question, and this is why they don't add up. And generally speaking, if they don't add up, they should be a multi-select question if you're curious. But we still, in the previous slide, in terms of lack of ability, increased. And here we have an increased ability to recognize target threats. I need this, right? This is something I don't have. And this comes back to our people and our technology, and we will continue to hit on these areas while we're talking about the various aspects of the report. Additionally, you can see the second highest tied at 40%, the ability to define a secure state and better identify anomalies versus the improved integration of security technology. So these are also very key areas to deal with. If we aren't able to identify what our normal business state is, then how are we going to identify what really is an anomaly, what's a bad activity, and so forth? And there are technologies out there that can help us to do that, and we'll talk about some of those in a few minutes. But I think it's important to understand that in any business, we need to have a security baseline of some kind. We need to know how people normally act, where data normally sits, how people normally interact with data, whether you use data classification or not. That's a kind of a bonus, if you will. But you need to understand these things, because if we don't know what people normally do, then how do we address the fact that this identity is suddenly acting in an odd way? There are some factors or some indicators, and we can see, and we'll hit on those as well. Additionally, the improved integration of security technologies, this is key. This is the foundation of this type of report. The evolution of data-driven security talks about how do we get more and better data to better manage our security infrastructure and our business as a whole. And so we'll definitely continue to hit on these as we move throughout the content of the presentation. Most significant frustrations with security technology. Tools unable to recognize emerging threats and attacks. Well, if you've been to any security conventions, events, etc., talk to any vendors, and probably talk to some of your peers, this is a very common issue. We have a lot going on in our environments. We have multiple custom applications out there. We have custom interaction with vendors, partners, and so forth. And so, again, recognizing what the baseline is versus recognizing what normal is difficult, and then you add on to that, what happens with these 0 days? How do I deal with a brand new attack that I've never seen before? Well, and that's part of looking at the anomalous behaviors and how we're supposed to do that. Second, vendors too slow to respond to emerging threats and attacks. Well, there's only so much you can do if you're trying to do something, for example, around signature-based technology, whether that's an antivirus or an IDS or whatever it is out there. The signature-based technologies obviously aren't able to address 0 day because you have to have a pattern to create a signature around, and then ultimately you have to research it and create the proper signature. So I think this speaks directly to those areas. If you're dealing with technologies that look more at anomalous behavior, those can have a slight edge over the signature-based technologies because you don't have to have that initial signature. Again, you have to understand what's going on in your environment to know what's an anomaly, but you don't have to wait and react to a signature delivery and so forth. The other thing we have with this, of course, is patching, and we do have vendors that drag their tails on patches. There's not much you and I can do about that unless we work directly for those vendors and in some of their Q&A shops and development shops. From that perspective, it's just going to continue on at the pace it is unless there's some additional means for them to be able to develop and patch faster. Of course, the caveat or the side note that we add to that is, well, why don't you produce better code to start with? Some of these things are no-brainers. However, at this point in time, as we see more attacks are leveraging at the endpoint applications as opposed to the operating system, not the operating systems are a non-attack zone, but we see far more attacks against endpoint applications, browsers, and things like that touch the internet directly. So the broad base of those applications is difficult to keep up with from a vendor perspective. Of course, they're focused on revenue, and they don't get much out of patching per se, other than possibly losing customers. So we just as an industry have to keep pushing on those vendors to deliver faster. The other thing I think that calls out to this specifically, which is a dichotomy in our industry, is the full disclosure versus appropriate disclosure versus non-disclosure. And we've had a lot of lawsuits in the last few years about security researchers who have tried to communicate about vulnerabilities and have been gag ordered or fined or otherwise sued into non-existence. And so that tends to be an issue as well. And the counsel I think that we need to take there is the ability to do appropriate disclosure versus full disclosure. Appropriate disclosure would be, I've identified a vulnerability, it's in this application, and somewhere in there you may discuss what the vulnerability is in terms of a processing error or a handling error or something like that. But I don't think from a delivery perspective we need to be delivering out to the internet the test code so that you can validate this on your own. And I think that's where the companies are really getting upset about this and bit, because once you do that, of course, you've just included a tool for some malicious hacker to be able to go out and create additional code and distribute it and so forth, so that they can do their nefarious deeds. So I think these are the push and pulls around that emerging threats issue. So who do the respondents feel have the greatest responsibility for improving the security as a discipline? I think this is very interesting because we do see some changes over the last few years between the studies. First of all, we can see that the respondents are putting a greater onus on the security tech vendors. And that's interesting. So they're saying, hey, everybody's delivering technology to me, whoever you are, vendor X, we expect you to provide better support, better intelligence, better insight, better ability to respond, these types of things. That this is the way we're going to improve as a discipline. So and I think vendors have heard this and have begun to respond. This is why we have some areas of exploding technology that we'll also talk about. Additionally, you can see here that we're looking for an increase from the standards organizations, whether it's SANS, ISC, NIST, whoever. There's plenty of organizations out there that will produce standards, but we need more. We need better. It's not just something that's very, very high level and open and to interpretation, which is one of the issues I think that we have now. We have lots of very good guidance from these organizations, but they try to make it very broad to cover every possibility. So it's a construct as opposed to guidance. If I were to make a contrast, PCI is a little more prescriptive at this point with 3.0 than it was previously, and I think that's the way that the various standards organizations are going to continue to move, and they're going to get more prescriptive about the types of controls and things. And that's something we've seen for a long time. If any of you have been in the auditing area, we see that a lot of what needs to be a control, or what's defined as a control or a mitigating control, is somewhat subjective to your auditor and what they perceive as appropriate or not appropriate. There aren't enough standards for them as well. Interestingly enough, we can see there was a pretty significant drop here in terms of professional services and outside security. Folks are relying on them a little less. And what we're seeing is they're engaging them to get them off the ground, but they're not looking at them as a long-term partner. And I think part of that's cost, right? We've gotten kind of pulled away from those resources because of their cost, and I think people are staying away from them based on the responses that we're getting. So there's some key areas here that came out, and I think those are important to note. Most of the other categories, very little change. A 1% change is really not statistically different, and that's a 0% change between these various other categories. So I think we've hit on some of the key areas that are occurring in the environments. So let's get on to some details that I know everybody wants to see. Some of the core. This was a pretty interesting slide, and from the details, there were lots of surprises here. I really like the information that we got out of the study from this perspective, and I want to hit on the slide pretty hard. So we can see here that from a deployment perspective, web security gateways, outweighed everybody. A good lead, 8% or 8 points, I should say, and that was pretty cool. Now, from that perspective, one of the things that after doing a little research, we know that the web security gateways have been around for a long time. That particular type of technology, I think it's been close to 20 years that type of technology has been out in some form, right? It's definitely evolved over that time. But one of the reasons that this is so well deployed is because of that legacy environment. You've got folks that have been deploying this and upgrading it and continually managing it over time. So having the longest lead in terms of the technology deployment, I think that's one of the reasons why this is good. Now, not to say it doesn't provide a great service as well, because it does. But I think that longevity is one of the main factors here. One of the other things that came out that I thought was very surprising was SIEM deployment. Now, SIEM has been around roughly 10 years, plus or minus a little bit. And a lot of vendors have come into play, and some have gone away in that time. But I was very surprised that only 40% of the respondents actually said they have deployed a SIEM. That to me was kind of one of those aha moments. Log management has been around since there have been more than one user and more than one computer. I felt that, generally speaking, the SIEMs should have deployed at a much higher percentage. I would have expected them to be up near where the web security gateways were. So that was a surprise to me that so few organizations overall have deployed. And that was large, small. It wasn't just SMBs, I can't afford it, so I'm not going to deploy it. It was across the board. And we'll get into some of the details around that as we go further as well. The next one that was kind of interesting here was the advanced security analytics. So this is the one that I focused in on based on the fact of the age of the product, as well as the technology, what the technology delivers. So security analytics and threat analytics as a field have only been around for about 2 years. Not a lot of players in this field until the last year, maybe less than that. There have been quite a few folks that have appeared in this. So now when we talk about security analytics and threat analytics, there are some vendors that have been around a very long time. For example, one of our sponsors, Guidance Software, they've been around for quite a few years, and they provided advanced analytics around disk forensics and things like that. So certain aspects of this have been around for quite some time, but when we're evolving into some of the additional advanced analytics, not a very mature market from either a vendor perspective in terms of number of vendors or longevity. Additionally, when we look at cloud application security management, this one was a very big surprise to me as well. This is very, very new. These technologies have been around for less than 2 years primarily. And what I mean by this, when I define the cloud application security management to the respondents, these were the vendors that look to identify who's using what cloud applications, shadow IT, or whether that's from a department or an individual level, and try and maintain control of cloud applications and the use and the data within those, and at least identify who's using them and how they're using them. So this is a very, very new technology. I think the oldest vendor has been out just under 2 years, and we've had about 4 or 5 entrants into that since October of last year. So that was pretty surprising that this has a 36% deployment rate within the organizations that we surveyed or that responded to the survey. APT and ATA, your advanced persistent threat and advanced targeted attack. This again is a pretty new technology in terms of deployment and marketing. It's been about I think it's been about 4 years as well. And from that perspective, I think that they've gained a lot of ground, and people recognize the value in trying to identify those types of attacks, and so this is why this particular area has really surged. I was surprised that the next generation firewalls were so low on the list in terms of percentage of deployments. Very good technology. It's been around for a number of years, so that was kind of interesting to see that that they don't have as much of a penetration into the market. I think this is an area that's going to continue to grow because those technologies do use a lot of very interesting tools within them to identify various types of attacks and so forth. And we've seen some acquisitions recently that by one of the main next generation firewall companies. They purchased an endpoint protection company that was fairly new, and so they're trying to incorporate these technologies so they can get faster from endpoint to gateway and stop various types of attacks or exfiltrations of data and so forth. Anti-DDoS was also another one that made a good showing, 37%. That was higher than I expected. I didn't really highlight in terms of color, but we know DDoS has been around for quite a few years now. I think the first one was in 1995 roughly, 1995. But it kind of died out in terms of attention and the glitz and the glitter, if you will. But in the last couple of 3 years tops, it's really come back. We've seen a huge increase in the number of DDoS and the types of DDoS attacks. So I think it's important to mention these guys in the fact that I think they're going to continue to climb up this ladder and move this way as we go because of the types of attacks that we're seeing. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the security analytics and threat analytics, folks. This is I think a key message in terms of people need more and better data, and with that, the security analytics tries to provide these types of data integrations. And you can see here that when we queried the respondents, 34% they said they already had a product in this area, and an additional 36% said they understand the technology and they're actively pursuing a possible investment. So that's pretty big. That's 70% of the overall market share that understands this technology in 2 years. That to me is incredible. Most technologies don't seem to move that fast. And so from that perspective, very, very large. And then if you continue to move down the scale, these folks have still heard about it, but they don't feel like they need it. And that's okay if they don't feel they need it. But you get down to all the way to here where we've heard about it, we don't understand much about it. But that gives us a 97% market penetration that someone understands something about or has heard something about security analytics or threat analytics. So for a roughly 2-year-old product set, that's pretty tremendous. And I think we'll continue to see this grow. And I'll mention some more areas around why this type of technology is gaining ground so fast. A couple of other things that I mentioned before in the surprises that I wanted to bring out in detail. Security and threat analytics tied with WAF, the web application firewalls, in terms of total customer satisfaction. So the question was based on the cost to purchase it and the effort and cost to maintain it from the time you've gotten it or received it, or purchased it, what kind of value do you think you've received? And we had the options of higher than expected, or lower than expected. You can see here that from this perspective, wow, 70% market acceptance for WAF versus 67 in terms of expected value, and then security analytics pushed forward a little bit higher and got a 28% higher than expected value. Again, for very new technology, that's pretty incredible. That means the vendors that are in this space are able to deliver information and abilities and capabilities that were not there previously in the arsenal, if you will. So, and I think a couple of the reasons that these are probably moving along as well as they are is that the security analytics and threat analytics do deliver a lot of actionable information. They tend to improve upon and compound upon your abilities if you have SIEMs and other technologies that are giving you information. And we'll also speak to that more in detail. And I think one of the reasons that WAF is rated so highly is because it is watching the critical transactions. You put it in front of your money, and you want to make sure that no one's trying to exploit your financial services and so forth. So from that perspective, it's delivering value. It's a good investment for the folks who have it. And we know that a lot of large financial investors, investment companies, we can do it, banks and so forth, have deployed that technology to help them protect their credit and other types of transactions. The APT and ATA and the cloud application security scored very high as well. You can see there that we have a 93% for APT, ATA, and cloud app got 94. So, again, very high value propositions in terms of expected value. When you look at some other technologies out there, the numbers weren't quite as high. So this being cloud app being so new, I don't know whether to attribute some of this to the sheer newness of the products and delivery, or the quality. And I'm not trying to deride the quality at all, but there's that whole I got a shiny new toy and here it is. Wow, this is awesome. So we'll see how this continues to bake out over the next couple of years as these mature, and the vendors either continue to have more in the space or combine, or however it ends up happening. But that's a pretty high expected value and higher than expected value for these two technologies. So another surprise, and this is probably one of the biggest that I got out of the study, was looking at ITGRC was at the bottom of the list in terms of deployment. There was only a 19% deployment in the market space, but if you look at that, 48% had higher than expected value. That is huge. That's tremendous from a value perspective. I've never seen a number that high from a higher than expected. So from the ITGRC perspective, those vendors are definitely producing a higher quality product and helping their customers to definitely see value in terms of risk management, asset management, and the other things that they provide. And I was pretty amazed by that. Now in terms of the overall numbers, you can see they only hit about an 89%, which was not as high in terms of total, but having a higher than expected value of 48% was huge. My perception on the lower than expected value, usually the two things that would affect this most are either they didn't address the use case properly before they purchased the solution, or they haven't been able to configure it and maintain it well enough to deliver the value they're looking for. Those are generally the two things that impact us from a lower than expected value. Vendors out there wouldn't be around for a while if they had a product that was junk. And they tend to go away when they do. So the ones that are out there right now that are primarily in this space have been out there for a number of years. They've showed their products have been improving them. So it really probably has to do more with customer end in terms of, again, buying the wrong product for the wrong solution, or not being able to maintain that product well enough based on either the size of the company, workflows, etc. So NAC was the big winner in the produced expected value. Again, when you look at 71%, that's huge from an expected value perspective. Very, very happy with NAC out there and getting value out of it. Very lower than expected value. So higher than expected value, also very high. So when you look at that from a percentage standpoint with 94%, it's up there with the previous slide. And it's just amazing to have a 71% expected value. That means you've got products out there that are definitely focused on delivering that end value, and they're able to articulate with customers what problems they solve, and so customers are able to buy the right solution for the right problem. Some of the other end. This is kind of interesting and odd, and we have kind of a dichotomy here. So Web Security Gateway had the lowest overall satisfaction, and I think that plays into you have folks that have had it forever. It does provide a value, and the thing I want to say up front on this is when you look at the total numbers here, none of these are bad ratings. When you have an overall expected or greater value in the 80+% range, which both of these do when you look at these combinations, that's not bad at all. These are just at the low end, and we were trying to identify why these were slightly lower than some of the other technologies. So again, I don't want this to be these are bad technologies, don't buy them. That's not at all the case. As long as you, again, trying to solve the right problem with the right technology, these vendors have a lot of value to add. And I don't know if anyone saw the quote from Symantec about antivirus being dead. And antivirus isn't really a part of advanced endpoint protection, but many of the vendors that provide the antivirus also provided advanced additional features that you can use. And so that was kind of an interesting quote in terms of trying to move away from just antivirus protection. That was Brian's intent, was saying, hey, we can't just rely on antivirus. There's a lot of companies out there that haven't been able to get beyond desktop antivirus, but we know that traditional antivirus is not the end-all, be-all, and won't support things. So let me go back on track a little bit here. So the Web Security Gateways, again, interesting that they had the lowest overall expected and higher value, but some of the things that can generally affect that are cost of deployment and no direct endpoint coverage. And what I mean by that is, one, if you're buying a very large system that you have to deploy at multiple gateways, then that can cost a significant amount of money if you have a very large enterprise. If you're dealing with one pipe that's fairly small, not a significant investment, generally speaking. If you're also dealing with these network communications, The web security gateways will catch things as they go outbound through whatever your internet gateway is. Absolutely, they can catch those things. However, there's a delay potentially between the time that something is inside your network trying to spread before it actually tries to communicate outbound and begin to spread or exfiltrate or whatever it's trying to do. So that could also be part of the perceived value chain and not being able to directly address endpoints, at least initially. Once, of course, it's tried to go through the gateway, your web security should pick that up and be able to say, hey, this IP address, this host, this user, depending upon which technology you're using, are doing something, and here's what we're seeing. With the advanced endpoint protection, some of the things that we're seeing in that area are, folks they buy the antivirus, then they upgrade to the advanced whatever protection, or they buy an advanced endpoint protection vendor to do something specifically, and it more relates around the former than the latter. But you have this lack of trust where we tried to do this before, and we either had little success or it didn't provide value, so we're just not going to pursue those options, even though we're paying for them. One of the things that comes out of there specifically is that difficulty in configuring the product. So depending upon which product you get and whether it's specifically focused around advanced endpoint or whether it's trying to do kind of everything in multiple engines or everything combined in one package of software, that can get fairly difficult to configure and maintain at an ongoing level. So from that perspective, those seem to be the biggest impacts on the advanced endpoint protection. But again, I want to reinforce that none of these are bad numbers when you look at this customer satisfaction. SIEM deployment. I mentioned earlier that I was surprised at how low SIEM deployment was, and so I wanted to dig into that as to what was going on and looked at length of deployment and some of the other things that could give us indicators. And the trend line here that you can see with the various red numbers, okay, that's the aggregate across all markets. So that tells us, the innovators across all markets were only 2% of our respondents that they had actually deployed in that time frame, 5%, 12%, and then we move into 24% in the late majority, and then laggards within the last year, and then ultimately we're back to the 53% that have not actually deployed. When we look at the percentages in this particular chart, something else to keep in mind is these areas here from laggards and back are representative of the organizations that have actually deployed, and this is the organizations that have not deployed. So when we look at this and break it down, we can see that the government and aerospace were some of the early adopters, or I should say the innovators, to use the correct term, and they were out there ahead of everybody, which makes sense. They're larger organizations, they have bigger budgets to spend generally, and they're also a higher profile in terms of attack, and we're seeing that continue to emulate that in current time as well. So they were some of the original adopters of the SIEM technology. When you move into the early adopter phase, you have the finance, banking, and insurance areas, as well as the healthcare began to adopt this technology as early adopters in that 6 to 10 year time frame. We have regulations that started coming out around HIPAA. That's not quite 10 years ago, if I remember correctly, but I may have that date a little off. But those organizations recognize the value of the data that they have and their interactions with clients and how they can be effective, so they began to be the early adopters. You move into the early majority, and you see another spike in the government and defense and aerospace, and that comes from both the federal side and the local side. So that they're seeing that their brethren out there who had adopted this earlier were having success with it, so they're going to deploy as well. And you can see there's a fairly even line, if you will, right along here with the other organizations in the early majority. When you get to the late majority, we see a spike around the all other category here. And we mentioned there was a number of industries there. And then that makes sense. Most of those industries that are combined in the all other are not high profile. They're not high target industries. And so it would take them a little longer to want to get to the level that they want to deploy this. Additionally, we've seen a huge surge in attacks and infiltration and exfiltration in the last 1 to 3 years, which was also a motivator for these organizations to get involved. We also see in professional services and consulting a big rise here, and that comes back to those organizations being called on to deploy in other organizations, as services, so that they can bolster either a lack of employee space or other issues in terms of trying to manage those logs and get the data out there and respond and so forth. So we've got those folks coming in to help out. And then lastly, we have a good chunk of folks here in the retail and distribution and so forth. And we're seeing that, of course, for some it may have been a little late. Did I say that? But in all seriousness, right, we've got technologies that are being deployed out there to be able to address these various attacks. Of course, the question is how well are they being deployed, and how well can they be used and monitored? Looking at response and prioritization relative to threats, I was kind of disappointed that we ran this study again 2 years ago, and you can see that the two lines are indistinguishable from each other. Very, very little difference in them. You basically 1 point at each end where you can see a tip up here and actually a tip down here and a tip up here. So it's sad to say, but it appears as though even though we really need to be able to prioritize threats and consistently monitor and so forth, that organizations aren't doing a great job at that. If only 56%, moving up to 57%, right, in 2014, are actually able to and providing services to consistently monitor and prioritize alerts, that's where we have a problem. And that speaks directly to Target's issue, right? They got alerts, but they just weren't able to consistently monitor and prioritize them based on the volume of alerts they were getting. And we've seen this in other organizations as well. So this is a consistent problem. Even though you have technology deployed, a lot of these folks have deployed SIEM. A lot of them, even more, I guess, haven't deployed anything in that area. And so it's no wonder for the folks that haven't deployed at all that they're not able to consistently prioritize and monitor their issues, because traditional log management, as it were, it can't keep up with the volume of data that most organizations are experiencing today. When we look at the utilities, financing, banking, and government, they are still the most deployed. They're doing the best jobs at monitoring their environments. Again, that makes sense. They have the most to lose. We have utilities and infrastructure. If the power goes out, if the water goes down, if we have an issue at a nuclear power station, heaven forbid, these are issues that have to be addressed very proactively and be very well monitored. So we're seeing, very high display of monitoring and prioritization in those organizations. Of course, the same thing is true with finance. If all the money goes away, people get kind of upset, and they expect the government to be able to hold their own in the world of nation-state hacking and so forth. So that makes a lot of sense that these organizations are deploying quite a bit and being able to monitor and prioritize. Interestingly enough, we have manufacturing in there. The manufacturing environment has picked up quite a bit in the last few years in terms of their show for monitoring. And essentially what we're seeing here at 50% is they're getting out there and they're deploying the situation. And if you look at the total number here, you've got, there we go. We've got an 88% that have deployed and they're identifying at some level. And so that's a very good showing on their behalf. It just sounds like they're having difficulty executing and finally, getting the final product out there to be able to get to the brass tacks, if you will, to steal something from manufacturing that they need to be able to do. So that was kind of a surprise, but I think that ultimately it does make sense in that we are seeing an increase in intellectual property theft and hacking against various types of sites to understand, so the hackers can get more information about how they manufacture and what they're manufacturing. So it makes sense that these folks are beginning to bolster their programs and get more out there. Top three, SIM frustrations. These fall back into what we're seeing for some of our other questions as well. So very good alignment. When we look at the big numbers here, we have 57% in the utilities and infrastructure say it's too much cost in relation to the benefit. So even though we saw overall we had a very high deployment rate and a very high satisfaction in the survey, the issue that we're coming into is that at least in certain industries they're finding it difficult to use the SIM alone to be able to address their needs. So that creates kind of an issue for them as well. I think most of that ends up being the size, the distribution, and the diversity of their infrastructures, causes a significant issue for them because they are at least continental, if not intercontinental and global. So this creates an issue for them being able to get all of their information back, get an cohesive structure, and be able to identify what's going on from a business perspective. if we move down into that 56 and 52% range, we have retail, wholesale, distribution, finance, and banking represented. And they're saying, essentially, we're not having as much of an ROI issue as we are just we're not able to integrate our data sources. We have these various types of information that aren't standardized, and we don't know how to get them into our system. And those are pretty high numbers from that perspective. And if you look at those particular industries, at least especially the finance, banking, and insurance, it's very important that they're able to get more information. And I think from the retail and trucking and distribution areas, those are also very important because you're looking at products on the shelves or not on the shelves based on problems in either scheduling, time frames, stolen items in transit, etc. So these folks need information. It could be anything from GPS data to fault management systems, risk management systems. There's all kinds of information out there that they're going to need to put in to try and correlate what's going on in their environments. I apologize that the 43% that's right here didn't come out very well for professional services and consulting, and this comes back to the idea that they're trying to bolster a lack of technical ability in their customers, not enough staff or expertise, right? So they're being called in to help get that additional oomph out of the products that have already been purchased. This was an interesting slide as well in terms of the SIEM implementation evolution, and I think it speaks to a number of different potential issues. So first of all, we all know that change is constant in life, but the question is how much change, and this slide brings that out in looking at, in terms of the various industries that we have identified, how much has their SIEM implementation had to change or evolve since they deployed it. And there's a couple notes to bring out here. When we look at organizations that have deployed, we have to take into account the length of time that they've had that SIEM deployed. Excuse me. And from that, if you have someone that was out in the laggards or the late adopters phase that hasn't had it very long, a lack of change is not necessarily a bad thing. They could be fairly accurate in what they've seen as or perceived as a need, and they deploy to that. And so you will have more of the hardly change potentially in those industries. And I'm not saying that each one of these as a whole is representative of a laggard or a late adopter, but I'm just giving examples of larger hardly change numbers. However, if you're looking at someone that's been in the innovator time frame, then you would expect more change. And I think that actually is directly represented. If you look at aerospace and government, since we know that they were some of the longest deployers, they're saying that, yeah, over time, we've actually deployed this stuff. We've had a good amount of change. And 87% said they've had at least somewhat of a change, and 13% have had a significant change in their deployment and the way that they're using that tool. Overall, we should see a change in the way we're using the tools because we know that the types of data that we're getting, the types of attacks we're getting, infrastructure and many technologies are changing. So there should be some evolution of change. If we're seeing a lot of change, that could be indicative of not being able to address a problem up front, not understanding the problem, and not understanding how to specifically use the technology to get it, and then adjusting to try and meet the environment. We know that manufacturing has jumped into this significantly in the last couple of years, and I think that's why we're seeing a lot of that change there. They're trying to get their feet under them, and they're adapting to whatever the situation is in their particular environments. So the other thing that was interesting here is professional services. This kind of comes back to what they were saying earlier, in that they are trying to bolster a lack of employees out there that can do this kind of stuff. So they're being called in to make these incremental changes for the most part, and in some cases overhaul systems. So I think this data does feed well into the other things that we're seeing out there. Desired data sources not supported by SIEM. So a couple of interesting items here. Machine learning, right? Machine learning is very new. A lot of SIEMs don't know how to address it in terms of their own technologies. It's something you have to build into your technologies. They're saying, hey, we need technology that can adapt. And 47%, biggest folks. So it's not just a buzzword. It actually is an area of technology that needs to be addressed. We know that SIEM has been the workhorse out there. They take millions and millions and petabytes of logs out there across the world, if not more, and chunk them down. They consolidate them, they correlate them, they normalize them, and they get down to some sort of base state whereby the individuals can hopefully find the needle in the haystack. Now, I think that's an interesting term, and I actually prefer the needle in the stack of needles, and that goes back to Target as I guess the poster child for that. But they were getting something like 60,000 alerts, and they just weren't able to prioritize. And the problem we have now is, especially in large organizations, your SIM can deliver thousands upon thousands of alerts. All of them can be, or many of them can be top priority, most critical. Well, we just don't have the people to be able to deal with that level of alerts that have to be dealt with right now. So we need technology augmentation to be able to deal with that, and that's where we'll see that security analytics comes into play and helps us to be able to move to finding the needle in the stack of needles, right? Which one's the biggest needle? Which one's going to poke me first? Which one is dipped in poison? Or whatever analogy you want to use. And we're finding that all of the SIM technologies out there really aren't created equal. They don't. As an industry, there's a wide variance in the quality of SIM technology and what they're designed to do. And so as you look for technology to help you address your various issues, you do want to sit down and get a firm view of your environment and your requirements on what types of data you need. Because some of the SIMs do not do well with unformatted or unstructured data. Some of the SIMs will do well, and I see I have a small misspelling there. I apologize, but I think that's important. That SIMs in general do very well with formatted data. If you can throw a log at them, most of them have connectors and abilities to translate that data and get it in the database, and they're all designed to help do correlation, normalization, and so forth. But it's just a matter of how do I get that extra oomph out of there. So depending upon the SIM you purchase, you may have some gaps in your collection areas. Or the types of alerts that are supported. And so these are things that you have to be able to dig into with your vendor when you're going to select them. Additionally, as we look at this, data warehouse is another big thing. With the explosion of big data warehouses are out there. Business intelligence is also another area that leverages heavily within the big data space, and we have to be able to address that. We have, as we know, an ever-growing volume of data, and I forget the statistic exactly, but it's something like we've created more data in the last, 2 or 3 years than has been created in all of mankind's history before that. So we can see that big data is very important. So the ability to warehouse data, interact with the warehouse, and provide interaction with those business intelligence systems is very key. Fraud detection systems, well, you can guess that one probably came from the financial industry primarily, but there's various types of fraud detection systems, and some of them aren't as standardized. Many of them in the very large organizations have been customized heavily, and so we need the ability to be able to integrate with those, and a lot of SIMs aren't providing that. Data sources need to improve. So you can see here risk analysis and management tools. This is hey, we need this. We need the ability to integrate with risk management. And I think that's where some of the IT/GRC comes into play, because a lot of the IT/GR, in fact, the IT/GR systems are designed to deliver risk information around your IT environment. So we're not getting that apparently out to them. The fraud detection was just mentioned on the last slide as well, and then we've also seen machine learning, and we move down there. So advanced analytics is still pretty high on the list. Full packet capture. I know we've seen acquisition, for example, one of our primary APT vendors out there just acquired one of the new full packet capture to try and augment their solution, and I think we'll continue to see more of that. 5 features desired by security analytics. So the folks out there that need these features say, hey, most of it we need the advanced automated response capabilities. Now, this is very interesting because there's very few companies out there that actually provide this type of response. There are a couple of them, and that's pretty interesting. And I think that's a very interesting correlation if you look back to the early 2000s when Cisco and Check Point began to integrate their IDS and firewall technologies so you could have an instant update of your firewall rules to block some sort of attack. And I put that in air quotes that you can't see. But I think that's important because back then, a lot of folks got burned because, especially when hackers learned about it or attackers learned about it, they could spoof an IP address and get you to cut off one of your primary vendors or a partner or primary customer. And so a lot of folks just ended up turning it off because it wasn't reliable. But now they're saying, hey, we need that. We don't have enough people. We do have some money to spend. So what kind of advanced automated capabilities can you actually provide to help me with this problem I'm having, because I just don't have enough people to do it all manually. The next item there, what the heck is increased aggregation for cross-analyzation of non-security data sources, right? Well, holy cow. I thought that was a rather interesting set of responses. But essentially what it says is we need the ability to ingest and correlate non-standard data types with each other and also with our existing security data. So that's an advanced analytics capability. And then you can see from there we need advanced data visualization. So depending upon your SIM, some of them provide data visualization, but again, it's the question of how detailed and how can they give you the visualization on data that they can't absorb. So this is one of those things, again, very important to pick the proper SIM and then augment that technology as necessary. Reduce false positive. You can see all these numbers are high, but reduce false positive is obviously very key to individuals out there, and I was surprised actually that this wasn't the number one. But I think that has to do with if you can do the first, if you can do advanced automated response capabilities, I guess they're assuming that you can do reduced false positives. At least I hope they are, given again what we had back in the early 2000s. But reduced false positives is a huge issue because we know, again, target being the whipping boy, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of alerts. Which ones are the ones that we need to address? Which ones are false positives, and so forth. The other thing that was interesting was guided response. So this is kind of the level before advanced automated response. I want you to help me use my employees and the technology to be a force multiplier. So the technology should help my employees be able to either do more by doing an advanced automated response, or it's going to guide them through it. So I can take a tier 1 person and put them down in front of the system, train them on how to use it, and then the system will actually walk them through how to respond to a particular issue wherever it is out there in my environment. And so I think that all of these are absolutely useful and needed, but I think these two will be the greatest force multipliers out there for our employees. Perception of SIM versus security analytics. So how are they different? Why are they different? Well, when you ask the respondents, this is very interesting. There's only 1% of our audience that said, I don't really see the difference. I don't understand the difference. I think it's just renaming of the old technology. And so that tells me that there's at least good messaging out there. Whether or not it's accurate, that's another story. But at least it's clear. And so people are beginning to understand how they're different. And when you get the responses back, 53% said, hey, I think there's a need for both out there. I think that we're going to stack them on top of each other and provide additional value within SIM. Let the SIM be that workhorse like we talked about before, and we'll use the security analytics with those machine learning algorithms and this automated or semi-automated response and all the things that it's beginning to offer. We'll bolt them together to produce that next generation of security response and ability. I see that I'm almost out of time here, so I apologize. It looks like I'm going to go right to the wire. The other thing that's important here is that some of them do see, hey, I think that we're going to see a natural evolution of SIM into that. And we actually do see that now. There are some SIM vendors that are producing themselves or marketing themselves as security analytics. And again, I'm not speaking to any individual vendor. Some, rightfully so, they're moving in that area. They have these additional features and technologies. And some, well, they're using it more as a marketing hype to gain market share. And that's something that comes back to you as an individual and being able to go through and identify what your requirements are and what these particular technologies do. But I think it's going to be very important because over time we're going to see either the SIM vendors are going to absorb or create this technology, absorb the current vendors out there or create it to survive, or we're going to see more people buying security analytics and possibly replacing that, though I do know that most of the security analytics vendors say they don't want to replace SIM, they just want to augment it. Okay, highly confident detection of security issues before impact. The advanced security analytics and threat analytics folks won in this particular case. It says we get the most actionable, concise, and useful information when we have this technology deployed, and we can go out and identify what the issues are as early as possible and respond to them. And I think that's where the rubber hits the road, right? We want to get this stuff done as soon as possible, as early as possible, so that we can respond. And you can see down the line, APT, ATA, very valuable technology. NAC, very valuable. None of these come up as an invaluable technology. We can see that this is, the perception there on the folks that own the web security gateways is they're not confident that they can identify what's going on with enough detail. And it depends on the web technology there, depending upon whether they can give you a full packet information or they're just giving you a small snippet of information. That can definitely impact the confidence in the ability to respond. But the advanced security and threat analytics vendors, they do have the ability to process, and in some cases to collect it themselves, but at least the ability to process that wide variety of information that some of the other technologies don't have the ability to do. Impact of security and threat analytics. So 90% of the organizations that deployed them said they have gotten reduced false positives and improved actionable alerts. And that speaks directly back to the last slide and why 45% said we feel better having this technology. So very high approval rating, very high satisfaction. And then they say, yeah, we've reduced our false positives. We've gotten rid of all the chafe and the haystack is gone, and we're actually able to process the needles in some realm of satisfaction. Lastly, we have the SIEM and SATA impact, SATA, I should say, the security analytics and threat analytics. So this is also important. You can see, has the introduction of SIEM tools or security analytics technology reduced the frequency or duration of investigations? And this is also directly where the rubber hits the road. I'm getting better information, and 50% said I've reduced both the frequency and the duration of my investigation. And this is key in security. Anybody in security, we know that. We have to. So I haven't had a chance to dig in, and I'm going to try and restructure my questions for next time to figure out how I can separate this out a little better and get a better slice of security analytics versus SIEM versus APT versus ATA and so forth. But I think it's important to see this from a high-level perspective, and that 50% we've reduced the duration and frequency, 24% they've at least reduced the duration of those. So that's a huge impact as well. I did get to this level of differentiation in the technology, and ultimately I think this is really key because when you look at the technologies individually as well as combined, you see some interesting correlations. We know that our goal is to get these reductions of investigations down into the minutes time frame. There was a study done by Monahan, a threat intelligence study that said, if the respondent said that if we can get down to a 60-second time of breach, in other words, we can identify that a breach has happened in 60 seconds, we can reduce our remediation cost by 40%. So we should be looking at technologies that will allow us to do that and get into that minute time frame. And we can see that if we didn't have anything, we had a 12% in the minute time frame versus hours, days, and then weeks or longer. Oh, I missed a number there, so I apologize. Ultimately, when we looked at APT, that shrunk it, so that's good. We brought that in, and we have a pretty wide range here in the hours time frame with some in the minutes. When we did SIEM only, we weren't quite as tight. There was all this information. People were having difficulty configuring their SIEM or the understanding of what to do, or just too much information to get down the actual information initially. So they deployed the SIEM, and they were able to push that up to 15%. Now in the APTs, my perception here is that APTs are good at alerting, but depending on the technology, some of them aren't as good at giving you very detailed information on where to go, and that might also speak to the acquisition that we've seen earlier in the week, end of last week, I guess, with trying to get the details on that packet capture. When we introduced threat analytics and security analytics by themselves, 24%. So that tells us that we're able to get rid of a lot of the chaff and pull that down to 24%. Ultimately, you can see how all these stacked out. When we had SIEM and APT, ATA, the SIEM was able to help us to some degree, but apparently it seemed that they were having some issues. They weren't going all the way out into that week's time frame, but they were getting a lot done in the hours time frame. So there's a lot of actionable information, just not able to keep it in that minute. And I don't have enough information to say why that is, but that was an interesting anomaly with the respondents. And then ultimately, as we move up, when we combine the security analytics, threat analytics with the SIEM and the APT, we got the maximum benefit of being able to have 25% of our incidents resolved in the minutes time frame rather than hours or above. And so I think that speaks very well to the layering of technologies, and each of these has their benefits. If you have to pick and choose, there's obviously data here that will help you to pick and choose, but ultimately, if you're looking for the best, 25%, that's pretty huge. So I appreciate your time, and I apologize. I actually went a few minutes over. I have time if anyone needs to ask some questions. We can get to a couple, I think, but I apologize for taking extra of your time. Raleigh, what do we have?
Thanks, David. We are running over, so let's just take one question. But for those of you who we did not have an opportunity to answer your questions, I will send those on to David, and he will send you a response. So David, why don't we take this question? What kind of functionality are prospects looking for in risk management tools?
What kind of functionality are prospects looking for in risk management tools? So they're looking for, that's a little bit out of scope of what we dug into, but what I can tell you is they need the ability to associate assets with vulnerabilities and context. And what I mean by context is if you have an asset that's very low use, very low impact in terms of either the revenue that it collects or the abilities that it purveys within the environment, that's important. So the risk analytics tools that we have are looking at both external information from third-party threat vendors, right? They collect data about what's going on the internet. They then are able to correlate that with the assets you have, the vulnerabilities on those assets, as well as how those assets are being used in the environment. And there's additional other factors as well. They can get very, very detailed depending upon how much time you want to put into them. But there are some really nice vendors out there that deliver quality products around this area and helping you then to prioritize which assets need to be addressed most expeditiously from a risk perspective, not just a vulnerability perspective, but overall risk to the business.
Great. Thank you, David. And I wanted to thank our audience for joining us and hanging on with us. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, you will be receiving an email from Enterprise Management Associates, and it will contain the on-demand playback. I'll also let all of you know when the full report is available. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.